Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Christine Danner, and I'm the Multimedia Manager for CTAN. Thanks for attending today. I'd like to remind you that while our speaker is talking, you are welcome to put any questions you have into the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll address your questions after the talk. I'd like to introduce Timothy Latimer, the co-founder of Fervo Energy. We will be hearing his talk, The Geothermal Decade. And now I'll leave the floor to Tim.
Great, thanks, Christine. Happy to be here and talk with this group today. This is exciting stuff on a good topic. By way of background, as Christine mentioned, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Fervo Energy. But I actually started my career in another part of the energy industry in the oil and gas sector and worked for several years as a drilling engineer for BHP Billiton, based out of Houston, working for, out in West Texas in the oil fields as a drilling engineer. But I got to a point fairly early on in my career where I learned a lot more about climate and got pretty passionate about it and realized that my day job of getting more oil out of the ground wasn't really aligned with kind of the very dramatic action needed on climate. So I started looking for something else to do. And I actually got very excited when I fell into the world of geothermal and learned that it was an area that I could apply my same skills as a drilling engineer, but instead of producing more hydrocarbons, do it for a clean energy and carbon-free resource instead. And I got even more excited when I started digging into the industry and realized that because geothermal is a bit of a smaller sector and one that doesn't quite have the same pace of innovation or financing or investment that the oil and gas industry did, there are actually a number of opportunities for more modern technology around drilling techniques, data acquisition, and other things to actually drive a big boost of improvement in the geothermal sector and hopefully open it up to be a much more broad-scale resource. So I actually quit my job in 2015. I left the oil fields to go to Stanford. I did my MBA there and a master's of science degree in the School of Earth Sciences as well, with a focus on geothermal reservoir engineering, and really spent a couple of years there workshopping the idea of how do I take this very abstract concept of applying technology from the oil and gas sector in a novel way in geothermal and making it a reality. And a lot of important steps along that journey, including meeting my co-founder, who was a PhD in Stanford's geothermal research program, and some of our early investors. And by the time I was graduating in 2017, we realized that we were onto something and that there actually was a market for geothermal, that there was new technology that could be deployed, and we could do it in a way that made sense to bring this valuable resource onto the grid. So we've been at it for just over 3 years. We've raised multiple rounds of venture capital. We've also been very fortunate to get a significant amount of government grant funding for different research concepts we're working on, from the Cyclotron Road program at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, to RPE funding, to funding from the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy through the Geothermal Technology Office. And so I've been able to build our company kind of bridging that gap between private sector funding and public sector funding, which are both very important for driving climate innovation. We've grown the team quite a bit and are working on our first set of field projects now and trying to deliver brand new megawatts with our technology by later this year, which is pretty exciting to be at this point as a company. And the only other comment I'll make before I kind of dive into my presentation here is I've titled my talk The Geothermal Decade because there's a number of converging trends right now that are making people revisit geothermal, improved technology, more aggressive action on climate, better policy and commercial environment that has really changed how the sector has been viewed. When I started my company in 2017, geothermal wasn't really on anybody's radar, and in fact was kind of the opposite in a lot of ways. And I even have memories of being at an investor conference one time and walking up to somebody and introducing myself as the founder of a geothermal company, and the guy literally said, "That's great, nice to meet you," and walked away without saying a word. And that was 2 or 3 years ago, and now things have changed quite a bit, and there's a ton of interest, a ton of commercial traction for geothermal, a lot of supportive policy, and a flood of new investment coming into the sector as people realize how valuable this energy resource is. So that's why we call it the Geothermal Decade, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit here. So I'm going to go ahead and test sharing my screen here to dive into my presentation. And I know the format here, people can put questions in on the side. Definitely going to have time at the end for Q&A, and would love to hear what's interesting or not interesting to y'all, and incorporate that into the talk as well. So please feel free to put questions into the side chat there for later discussion. But I'm going to see if this works. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about geothermal technology in a broad sense. Being a smaller resource, one with great potential, but one that's not really around much right now, a lot of people don't know about it. So I'm just going to provide a little bit of an overview of the sector and technology. And then I'm going to dive in and talk about the global trends in geothermal energy. You know, the things that we're seeing on the investment side and the market and the technology side that are really driving, you know, what is the geothermal decade. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about what my company does. So just talking about diving into geothermal. There's geothermal energy at different scales. So this is one thing that I always have to be very careful about, because geothermal means different things depending on where you are in the country or how deep you're drilling. You know, if you go to the Northeast in the United States, when people talk about geothermal, they typically are talking about residential geothermal, drilling a few tens of feet or a few hundred feet down to you use a ground source heat pump to actually have a far more efficient way of heating and cooling your home. And that's kind of the smallest scale geothermal. And it's not electricity generation. It's really for home heating and cooling, but it's a very powerful resource. It becomes far more efficient than just using heat pumps on their own in the right conditions. And there's a lot of traction in that space right now too. A company I put on here to highlight is Dandelion, which is a big company that's backed by one of our investors, Breakthrough Energy Ventures, that's tackling problems in making home geothermal a lot more cost effective. But that's kind of at the very residential end of the spectrum. Then there's this middle ground that we call direct use. And this could be really anything. This is drilling deeper. You know, you're going deeper in this case than in residential geothermal. You're going, you know, hundreds or even thousands of feet down to actually use that geothermal heat directly in some sort of commercial or industrial process. So the picture that I have here is actually a facility that I visited a couple of years ago in Naivasha, Kenya, where they have a geothermal, they're using the geothermal heat directly from deep wells to heat up greenhouses so that they are maintained at a constant temperature year round to promote faster growing cycles, and aquaculture ponds. You go around the world and there's a ton of direct use. If anybody here has ever been to Boise, Idaho, they actually use direct use in Boise, Idaho to heat most of the buildings downtown. So they don't actually, it's a very carbon friendly way to do it because they're using the natural heat of the earth to heat most of the downtown. And that's pretty common in China and Scandinavia. Many places in the world use geothermal heat directly to power their, to heat homes and buildings and for agricultural purposes as well. You know, it's so efficient in some places like Iceland that they actually run geothermal pipes under the roads there, so snow melts automatically because they keep the roads warm from the geothermal energy. And a lot of times people in the wintertime in Iceland use that geothermal heat and will even leave their windows open so they can get a fresh breeze. But because it's a carbon-free resource that's highly efficient, you know, there's not really a significant carbon environmental impacts on that. So it's a really great thing to do. But the focus of most of this presentation is going to be what's on the far right side of the screen, which is utility scale geothermal. And this is drilling much deeper to find water that's quite hot. And it's produced as steam that's captured at the surface and powers a turbine. And so just wanted to get that out of the way up front, because a lot of times geothermal means something differently between where you are. I'm a big fan of all these resources. Throughout this talk, you'll hear I'm really a big advocate for the entire sector. Very excited about what Dandelion is doing, very excited about direct use cases around the world, but what my company focuses on is utility scale power generation. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So here's a more detailed schematic of how geothermal actually works. In geothermal, you drill deep injection and production wells. You end up pumping cold water down the injection wells. It sweeps across the reservoir that you see here and heats up during that time and then returns to the surface as hot water or steam that can then be captured at the surface to create electricity. And depending on where you are in the world, this could be quite a bit different. You know, there's geothermal in over 25 countries around the world. The depth can be anywhere from a few hundred feet to deeper than 12,000 feet. The temperature could go from 70 to 400 degrees Celsius, and the scale could be down to a few megawatts, or you can go to the geysers in Northern California, just a couple hours north of the Bay Area, and you can find a field that's producing over 1 gigawatt. The largest geothermal field in the world is the geysers in California, although that's probably going to lose its title in the next couple of years because the Alkaria field in Kenya is growing so fast that it's going to take over as the largest geothermal field in the world at over 1 gigawatt in the next year or two. So this is how geothermal works. It's all about finding that resource where the heat and the natural heat of the earth is closer to the surface, and you can flow and circulate a fluid through it to capture that heat and bring it to the surface for electricity. There's also different ways at the surface that you can produce electricity from geothermal. So the very first projects were done in places where you could drill in and it was so hot that steam was literally coming right out of the ground. And that's what you see on the far left, the dry steam plants. And that steam would go directly into a turbine and then be pumped down a reinjection well and circulate that way. Now, as people started developing lower temperature resources, they had to run it through a flash separator. So that middle part, the flash steam plants, let people access slightly lower temperature resources. And then a few years ago, major innovations in what we call binary cycle power plants, which is on the far right side of the screen, unlocked a much bigger resource too for geothermal. That lets you access geothermal at even lower temperatures. And in the case of a binary cycle power plant, you actually bring up the production well, the reservoir fluid, and then you run it through a closed loop heat exchanger at the surface that heats up a different working fluid that powers the turbine and uses a dry cooler to actually cool the power plant. And so one of the big advantages of the binary cycle power plants on the far right is they can be smaller systems, they can be modular systems, they're much more flexible, and there's actually no carbon emissions of any kind associated with them because they're closed loop at the surface, and you can re-inject all that fluid right back down. In the case of the dry steam and flash steam power plants, they're far, far better than fossil fuels. They're a green energy, climate-friendly resource, but sometimes because you're using evaporative cooling, there can be carbon emissions or other emissions associated with them. And that's something folks in Iceland or Northern California are familiar with, but that's actually kind of an older style of geothermal that isn't what Fervo develops and really isn't what's in the market today, which is on the far right, the binary cycle power plants. In terms of growth, the vast majority of new geothermal in the United States is that newer kind of binary cycle power generation. Because you can access geothermal resources at lower temperatures, it means that there's a lot more places you can go to develop geothermal cost effectively. And so the early days was developing these dry steam plants, then these flash plants came on, and then really the last 10 years has been the story of commercializing binary cycle power generation. And so this is a picture of the installed capacity of the United States. There's about 3.5 gigawatts of geothermal in the United States right now. It's not a huge percentage of the mix, but it's still pretty meaningful. It's just under 1/2% of the US electricity mix, but in certain states, it's incredibly important. So California gets about 6% of all of its electricity from geothermal. Nevada gets about 12% of all of its electricity from geothermal, so it can be a very meaningful resource. When you go around the world, there's places like Iceland, which is kind of famous for its geothermal. A little over 2/3 of the energy supply in Iceland come from geothermal, and there's other countries like Kenya, I mentioned before. They're growing very quickly. It's now around 60% of the electricity generated in Kenya comes from geothermal. So much, in fact, that in combination with their hydro resources and some growing wind and solar resources in the country, that Kenya is actually on track to become a 100% carbon-free renewable energy country in the next year or two, because they're continuing to grow out these geothermal resources so quickly. So it's not a huge part of the global mix, but in the right markets, it's really meaningful and important. And it could be a lot bigger. You know, we've barely scratched the surface of what geothermal can do. You know, so I talked about the 3 gigawatts installed in the US today, talked about the 15 gigawatts installed around the world. But if you look at the places we can develop geothermal, especially if we're able to drive costs down and continue to unlock new technology like binary cycle power generation, really there's no limit for how big geothermal can get. And so the technology plans that the Department of Energy have developed and that we're big believers in showcase a way for us to double the geothermal capacity in the US over the next 10 years, and then continuing to drive technology performance in a way that makes it really pick up its growth after that. So if you think about a lot of the targets longer term, 2045, 2050 for decarbonizing, we can get orders of magnitude more geothermal on the electric grid by that point in the US and around the world. The chart on the right kind of shows where there's a lot of potential, really a lot of coasts. You can see the East African Rift, a lot of island nations. What's really interesting about this chart is if you think about where global population is, it overlaps quite nicely with a lot of where the geothermal resource is. So a significant percentage of the world's population lives in an area that could be economically developed for geothermal, in the coming decades. So there's quite a big opportunity in terms of capacity, investment dollars, grid connections, and also obviously the whole goal of this is to reduce carbon emissions to address climate change. So geothermal is the resource that with the right technology can have a very significant impact. So we've just, want people to take away that we've just barely scratched the surface of what geothermal can do. I want to talk a little bit about what I mentioned before, why this is the geothermal decade, why we're driving why there's so much renewed interest just in the last year or two around geothermal. So first off, just to sell geothermal a little bit, it's a pretty unique resource in terms of what it can provide. It's always on. It's not dependent on the weather for production. It's a carbon-free resource. It's dispatchable. Geothermal can ramp up and down. It does so all over the world. It's relatively inexpensive compared to a lot of other no-carbon resources, particularly things like nuclear energy. And it's fast to build, in comparison to other things, again, in comparison to nuclear energy or other zero carbon resources that we might want to think about. And it's also modular and scalable. You can develop geothermal resources, like I said, down to the scale of just a few megawatts all the way up to over 1 gigawatt. So there's a lot to like about geothermal. And 2020, well, I should say 2021, this decade has ushered in a new age for the development of geothermal energy. So there's a bunch of converging trends. First, technology is driving cost reductions in geothermal, as well as solar, wind, and batteries, which I think are stories that people are a little bit more familiar with. But if you think about geothermal, the majority of the cost of geothermal development is in the drilling phase. And where I started my career in oil and gas, we saw a tremendous ramp up in technology and performance. I think everyone's pretty familiar with the nearly 90% reduction in cost of solar, the 70 or so % cost reduction in wind over the last 10 years that have really opened up the possibilities for a renewable energy sector. But you've seen the same thing. We've seen the same thing in drilling. Drilling productivity in the United States is about 10 times higher than what it was 10 years ago. Now, to date, what that has done is mostly unlocked more oil and natural gas resources. But what Fervo is focused on, and what I think is very compelling about the industry, is we can repurpose some of that technology to drive improved cost and performance for geothermal. Decarbonization policy is also moving towards 100% clean energy. So when we started Fervo a few years ago, kind of the most ambitious renewable portfolio standard targets in the United States were in places like California, where they contemplated 33% renewable energy or 25% renewable energy. But in the last couple of years, we saw Hawaii and then California and now a number of states no longer thinking in small steps and low targets, but actually thinking about what it means to have a 100% clean energy target. And geothermal really shines there as a resource that works 24/7. We're also seeing a big trend in the private sector where corporations and utilities are becoming a lot more proactive in buying power and getting more sophisticated and looking to solutions like geothermal energy to meet their company's demands. And we're also seeing advancements like what I've already talked about in binary cycle power generation that have really unlocked and opened up a lot more places for geothermal energy development. So diving in a little bit on the decarbonization policy, there's now 8 different states with 100% clean electricity standards. And they're actually found quite a bit in the Western United States. So we've mapped here both where geothermal hotspots are in the United States, which are mostly in the Western United States, and also where states have 100% clean electricity standards. So if you look, really important states like Washington, Hawaii, California, Nevada, New Mexico are these states that have put the policy goals in to drive to 100% clean electricity. And they're also ones that have a great domestic geothermal resource. So these are the places that are going to be kind of the early adopters of new geothermal technology, because they both have the policy support and the geologic resource to promote geothermal development. And this is changing quickly as well. So there's been a few more recent policy developments that are really showcasing the value of geothermal energy as well. So if anyone here is in California, you're probably very familiar with the rolling blackouts that occurred last summer and kind of highlighted needs for increased reliability on the California electric grid. The California Public Utility Commission released a report a few weeks ago that's about to become a binding commitment that found that the shortfall of electricity capacity in the state of California was going to become even more significant over the next few years, and that they needed to start mandating procurement of certain reliable resources to continue to meet the reliability needs of the state while also achieving the decarbonization goals laid out in SB 100. And so what they said is that they need to procure a lot more of everything, wind, solar, batteries, of course, but they also put a specific mandate in for 1,000 megawatts of long duration energy storage, kind of a first of its kind procurement there, and also a mandate for 1,000 megawatts of new geothermal procurement in the state of California by 2026. And so California only has about 1,500 megawatts of geothermal today. And so adding another 1,000 is going to be, over a 50% growth just in the next 5 years. And that mandate is probably going to be, it's working its way through the regulatory filings, but it's going to be put into law and put in as a binding mandate relatively soon. And so, it's just a recognition that as we get to these deeper levels of decarbonization, the kind of reliability and 24/7 nature of geothermal is very, very valuable. And so that kind of 1,000 megawatt mandate, a mandate to grow the sector by 50% in just 5 years is the kind of thing that's going to kickstart this industry and is driving a lot of commercial interest. Corporations are also starting to drive interest in geothermal. So, I think corporate procurement is one of the most powerful tools to drive new technology and innovation into the market. I know this is a climate tech focused conference, but one of the things that's really important about scaling any new technology in the market, whether it's on the power generation side or efficiency or agriculture, you name it, is that early catalytic procurement. The type of companies that become passionate about a particular goal or mission or see business value in building a competitive advantage and being a first mover in a market can really be the thing that lets technologies like my companies and others scale. So if you think about kind of the evolution of corporate social responsibility, in the 2000s, the first companies announced that they were moving towards a carbon neutral target and did so at the time with the lowest cost and easiest available tools, which was basically just to buy carbon offsets. And that was kind of the gold standard in the 2000s for companies that wanted to offset their carbon emissions. Now, in the 2010s, what you saw is with the dramatic drop in cost of wind and solar, is corporations can actually afford to buy renewable energy directly. And so many companies, first Google and then a bunch of followers, set a 100% renewable energy target. And that kind of early procurement was very important in the early days of wind and solar to help scale those technologies to be kind of the mainstream adoption level that they are today. But 100% renewable energy from a corporate procurement standpoint is typically done through RECs or some other accounting mechanism where they don't actually worry about load matching or actually powering their facilities with renewable energy. But what they do is they add up all the energy they consume throughout the entire year, and they add up all the renewable energy that they produce or that they buy throughout the entire year. And if those two columns are at the end of the year matching, then they consider it to be 100% renewable energy. And that's kind of the standard definition in this segment. But a lot of companies have accomplished that goal already. Google was the first one several years ago, and then there's a couple other that are hot on their heels. And there's become now a growing recognition that 100% renewable energy is a great goal and very important in catalyzing wind and solar technologies. But if you're not actually powering your facilities with carbon-free electricity, at the end of the day, it's still kind of an accounting exercise. And so Google has been the first one to announce, and now you're seeing utilities and public jurisdictions like Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, LADWP, that have now announced goals to do 24/7 carbon-free energy. And in contrast to 100% renewable energy, this actually does mean that if you're using energy at a certain point in time, you need to be producing that with carbon-free electricity, which actually turns out to be a much more difficult problem. But I think this is going to be a decade where 24/7 clean carbon-free energy becomes kind of the new gold standard for what corporations can do to catalyze new technologies to address climate change. And so we're very excited that Google's made that goal, and we expect others to follow them. And it does have the benefit of catalyzing technologies beyond just wind and solar, right? So you have to do batteries if you're going to do this, and you have to look at resources like geothermal that can produce around the clock. And just to kind of drive that point home, tons of studies have now looked at how far we can get with wind, solar, and batteries. And the good news is we can get pretty far. And there's a strong argument to be made to build as much wind and solar and batteries as we can as fast as possible, because there are no markets right now that are anywhere close to 60 to 80% wind and solar powered. And what study after study shows is that that's kind of the tipping point where costs start going up exponentially because of the variable nature of wind and solar. So the cost of adding storage really starts to tick up around that 60 to 80%. And so buyers are still relying on coal and gas during periods of low wind and solar. And like I said, we're very far away from this 60 to 80% target right now in basically any market in the world for wind and solar. So there's going to be a ton of runway for wind and solar, but we need to be thinking about what's the resource that's going to get us to that last number. And I think just to give an example of this, kind of another current event, if anybody was able to review the studies that's called the LA 100 study that came out today, which is where the city of Los Angeles worked with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to say what would it actually take to get to a completely hourly matched carbon-free grid for the entire city of Los Angeles by 2035. And they found, unsurprisingly, you need to build a lot of solar, you need to build a lot of batteries, and you need to build a lot of transmission lines. But every single scenario they ran had between 10 to 20% of the total electricity mix coming from geothermal. And that's just because, getting those most challenging hours of the year to be decarbonized when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining and it's really cold out and the heat load is really high, you do need another resource that can complement that. And it's starting to become pretty clear that we can do complete 100% decarbonization if we're able to bring on a resource like geothermal to produce 24/7 to just cover that last 20% of the electricity grid. And all these things are driving a bunch of new trends into the geothermal sector. So when I started this company again in 2017, really through 2019, in the entire United States, there was only one new geothermal contract signed by across the entire industry. And now in 2020, there were over 8 signed, and there's actually been a few more in 2021 as well. So we've gone to kind of nothing to this very quick ramp up in geothermal interest from different utility players, universities, private corporations, CCAs in the sector, who are all looking at the same trends around getting to deep decarbonization, looking at grid reliability issues, and really thinking about geothermal. So just as an example, late last year, we had a utility call us up and say they were interested in buying geothermal from us. We asked them how much, and their response was, we'll take as much geothermal we have as quickly as you can deliver it. So as these carbon commitments, as these policy changes come in, and as we start thinking more about the long-term deep decarbonization goals, more and more groups are recognizing the need for a resource like geothermal to come and be a really valuable complement to wind and solar in the electricity sector. But new technology is really needed to unlock this sector. And there's a lot of, there's a lot of tailwinds that I've discussed driving, new tech, new commercial traction, new investment into the sector. There's still some real barriers to geothermal development. And I think I put this chart on the right here to just kind of showcase what we're talking about here in terms of geothermal being somewhat stagnant up until now. You go back to 2005, and that was actually the last year that geothermal energy was the largest source of renewable energy in the US among geothermal, solar, and wind. And wind has clearly taken off on quite a nice trajectory since then. Solar continues to grow very quickly, but geothermal has been relatively flat over that time period. Now, a lot of that comes down to some of the market trends I've talked about have really only materialized in the last few years. Things like states and cities and companies actually thinking about deep decarbonization as opposed to low-level RPS targets. But a lot of it comes down to cost and technology and regulatory issues. So a few things that are unique to the geothermal sector that need to be solved for us to really achieve this goal is, number one, there's high risk in project development. In contrast to something like a solar resource where we've got pretty good predictive capabilities on how sunny it's going to be at any point in the US throughout the year, the geothermal resource is thousands and thousands of feet underground. And so typically early on in the project cycle, you have to spend tens of millions of dollars to drill down and find a resource in order to confirm that it's there. And the private sector's appetite for taking on that kind of risk for an uncertain project is slim. And so there's some major challenges there. Long development timelines are also an issue. It can take over between 4 to 8 years, or in some cases even longer, to develop geothermal energy resources. In large part, that's because a lot of the geothermal is found in the western United States, where it's on federal lands, and federal lands have a much more complex regulatory and permitting process than you find on private land. So it becomes very challenging to develop because of all of the permits and regulatory requirements. And one thing that I've found to be wildly unfair since I've gotten into this sector is there's a whole set of what they call categorical exclusions to permits that you need to develop on federal land if you're an oil and gas operator. So the oil and gas industry can go and check a few boxes, and the regulator says, okay, this is a routine operation, we'll fast track your permits and you're done. Those categorical exclusions are not extended to the geothermal energy sector. So if I want to go drill a well in the United States today, and I call it an oil well, it's actually a lot easier and there's a fast track permitting process for me to get that done. If I want to drill a very similar well, but call it a geothermal well, there's a multi-step review process that the oil and gas industry is not subject to, that has to go through. That's been one of the biggest barriers to bringing on development here. And so there's major policy hurdles that still need to be overcome. And there's also been times where there's been a lack of policy support at the federal level. So the investment tax credits, where the federal government foots some of the bill for wind and solar development, geothermal used to be included and then got left out in 2015, and for 4 years had to compete against wind and solar without having access to the same tax credits. And so the solar tax credit throughout that time period was 30%. So if I'm developing a geothermal project and somebody else is developing a solar project, before we even start the project, their project is 30% cheaper than mine because they got access to federal tax credits that geothermal was locked out of. Finally, we got put back into the investment tax credit system in 2020, and that also, it's no accident that's one of the years that that interest in geothermal commercially ticked up significantly. So, when geothermal is given a level playing field, it actually leads to we can compete. So that's been really important. One of the newer things is restoring us to that level. And then finally, I hit this point up front that it's uncertain development, but just to drive this point home, even confirmed resources can be costly. 1 out of 3 geothermal wells that are drilled end up being useless. They end up finding no resource, and even if they cost millions of dollars to drill, they can't be productive because they can't support commercially viable flow rates. So it's a major barrier to the industry. But fortunately, there's a lot of startups working on this. I'll talk about my own in a second, but one of the things that's exciting, Climon is a company that is developing technology to allow even lower power generation from even lower temperature geothermal fluid. So typically today, you don't find many geothermal resources that are even cooler than 150 degrees C or around 300 degrees Fahrenheit. But Climon's developed technology and is driving the cost down to open up geothermal to resources as low as 7 degrees Celsius, which could have the same impact in broadening the footprint of geothermal. Another thing that's very exciting in the geothermal space is that the geothermal brine that's produced is often very rich in lithium. And as we start thinking about providing electric vehicles with more, with batteries, the raw material of lithium becomes very important. So there's companies and startups out there like Lilac Solutions that are working on mining lithium for electric vehicles directly from geothermal brine, which could be something that adds additional revenue streams to the resource. And California has actually put a significant amount of state money now behind an initiative that they call the Lithium Valley to create a geothermal lithium co-production center in the Imperial Valley in Southern California to fuel the lithium supply needed for the electric vehicle revolution. And the projections are that resource in Southern California could produce as much as 30% of all global lithium supply. So there's big benefits to developing geothermal that way, and it provides an additional revenue stream to help these projects get going. And then I talked a lot about how difficult it is to find the resource. And so there's companies out there like Zanscar that I'm very excited about that's using passive seismic and machine learning techniques to identify, to be much better at predicting where geothermal resources are. So if you can solve that problem, it becomes a lot easier to secure financing, scale up projects. If you can get a lot better at imaging what's tens of thousands of feet down. So those are the other startups I'm excited about. I'm going to tell you a little bit about mine now, and then hopefully we can have some time for questions and discussion afterward. But our company talked about this for a while, but we provide geothermal energy 24/7 for major power purchasers. And there's just a lot of groups now that are really interested in 24/7 reliability. And there's a few things that we do differently. I showed you the diagram of geothermal energy before, but here's what we're doing at Fervo. The first thing that you'll notice is instead of drilling vertical wells, we actually drill horizontal wells. So we have the same injector and producer wells, but instead of them being very far apart and only vertically, we actually have the technology to drill down thousands of feet and then turn sideways and drill horizontally for thousands of feet, so that each well you drill actually has much more access to the geothermal resource in the subsurface than historically, just from vertical wells. We also have technology that allows us to distribute that flow evenly across the whole horizontal section so that we're getting an efficient flow across the entire geothermal reservoir. And we've developed technology that allows us to use distributed fiber optic sensing in the wellbore to measure, optimize in real time where the flow rate's going. So a lot of the uncertainty around geothermal development that I highlighted before, because you're talking about a resource thousands of feet down, you don't know what's going on, is something that we can overcome because we can use fiber optic sensing that's laid across the entire wellbore to do real-time fluid flow measurements that provide great insight into our development. We've shown that this system can provide, through field tests and modeling work, that can provide flow rates as much as 4 times higher than traditional geothermal systems. And that has an impact of really lowering the price, so that it's at competitive electricity prices today. And we can do it in a much broader geographic footprint than where geothermal's typically been found. So this is just the same view as before, except we're now looking as if you're at the top of the earth, looking straight down. This is an output from one of our reservoir simulation software. And you can see as this goes here, we've got our cold injection well that goes down thousands of feet, horizontally thousands of feet. And then we've got fluid flow that crosses from these wells into the production wells. And we're doing it across, hundreds of different points here across thousands of feet of reservoir. So in contrast to traditional geothermal, where you might just have one flow zone in one vertical well, we can put hundreds in a single well and distribute the flow evenly across that. And that just leads to a much longer lasting, higher performance, higher productivity system. I've got a great team. I guess I could talk about that for a second. I think for us, it's very important that we're leveraging innovation for the oil and gas sector and hiring the brightest people behind that, but also complementing that with deep expertise and experience from the renewable energy sector and knowing how to do renewable energy development right. So I talked about myself and my co-founder earlier, where we met at Stanford, but just highlighting a couple of folks on here. I think Banu Aksoy, our COO, is pretty emblematic of the type of person we try to attract, where she started her career in oil and gas, then worked for years at PG&E, and then for a innovative hydropower developer in Turkey before joining us. So she's got that oil and gas and renewable background, similar with folks like Don Owens, who developed over 800 megawatts of power for NRG before joining Fervo and helping us scale our geothermal development. And the last thing I'm going to put up here is the importance of world-class partnerships. I think this is something broadly that's very important in climate tech. The problems we're trying to solve here are far too big for anybody to go alone. And you need a broad collaborative approach. And this is one thing we always say at Fervo: we don't want to be the only people to be successful in geothermal. We want to be the first mover in a vibrant and successful industry. So in our just over 3 years of existence, we've created collaborations, developed new technology, gotten research funding with university partners such as Stanford, University of Wisconsin, Rice, Princeton. We've raised multiple rounds of venture capital now from some of the most passionate and recognized climate investors like Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is a $1 billion clean energy VC fund set up by Bill Gates and others to back companies tackling the hardest problems in climate change. And we've continued to work with the National Lab System, and through the Activate program at Cyclotron Road, we've been very successful in building longstanding collaborations with the national labs, who are just a great resource for innovation. And then we've continued to tap into resources from the private sector. So we work closely and have long-term collaborations with organizations like Schlumberger and Baker Hughes, some of the biggest oil field service providers, and they're helping us adapt their technology that was originally developed for oil and gas to work in geothermal settings. And I think maybe the last thing I'll say, because that's a good segue on this, that's something I'm personally very passionate about. I'm from Texas. I went to the University of Tulsa, where many of my friends worked in the oil and gas sector. Oil and gas is a huge employer in this area, and really all around the world, whenever you go to different markets that have a lot of reliance on oil and gas, whether it's Nigeria or Argentina or elsewhere, these places, oil and gas workers are folks that in my career, are some of the smartest people I've worked with, some of the best people I've worked with. And we are going to go through this energy transition. We have to address climate. We have to move to cleaner sources of energy. But I think it's really important that we're doing that in a way that doesn't leave the communities and workers behind that are in the more legacy industries. And one of the things that I'm passionate about with Fervo, and we do this with our employees and our contractors and partnerships with organizations like this, is we give those fossil fuel workers an opportunity to work in a new industry where they can apply their skill set, but doing it for a sustainable resource instead. And I think having a just transition for fossil fuel workers and giving them an opportunity to participate meaningfully in the clean energy transition is very, very important. And it's something I'm quite passionate about. And we're excited about the collaborations we have with companies that are traditionally more focused on the oil field sector. So that's that. And I think just, the ultimate goal of Fervo, we firmly believe that geothermal, for all the reasons I stated, could be the last missing piece of the puzzle that complements wind, solar, and batteries to let us achieve that deep decarbonization, 100% round the clock goal. And the fact that geothermal can be cost effective, modular, work 24/7, be dispatchable, makes it the perfect resource to be kind of the final pillar of the energy transition. So we're big believers in a 100% clean energy future, and think that the kind of innovation we're driving in geothermal can be the last piece of the puzzle that gets us there. So thanks for your time, and happy to take any questions about geothermal or startups or policy or you name it. I'd love to hear what folks are interested in.
Great. Well, thanks, Tim. We have a variety of questions for you. The first one comes from Nikhil, and he wants to know, what are some of the qualities of a geothermal hotspot? Is it aligned with geyser activity? And how large is a hotspot typically for utility scale solar?
Yeah, so you need really 3 things to have an effective geothermal resource. The first is probably the most obvious one. It has to be hot. And that is typically driven by, geologic activity. You see a lot of geothermal along the coast because that's where you have the different, collision of the different tectonic plates that kind of drives a lot of that geologic and volcanic activity to the surface. We also see a lot of it in the Western United States because one thing I like to tell people is the California is actually, it's on its own plate, and slowly over geologic time is leaving the rest of the United States behind. And so what that means is actually the crust in the western United States underneath states like Nevada and Utah is thinner and brings heat up closer to the surface, which is why there's great resources there. So heat's very important. That's actually the same thing that's happening in the East African Rift. But you also need to have the right permeability and fluid flow to be able to circulate fluid across a large reservoir and bring it to the surface. So we have to find the heat, we have to find the permeability, and we have to find the fluid, and they all have to be co-located in the same position. And finding those things from just the surface can be difficult. This is why it's important. And I highlighted a startup called Zanskar. It's working on new methods to image the subsurface. So those are the things that make for a good geothermal resource. And I mean, they could be anywhere from very isolated, just maybe a few square miles, to regions that expand over, tens or hundreds of square miles, depending on where you are in the world. And so I think probably the best way to say it is just in terms of megawatts, which is what I highlighted before. There's some geothermal plants that are just a few megawatts, and then there's some that are 1,000 megawatts. And the ones like the geysers in Northern California cover, it's a pretty substantial hotspot to be able to support 1,000 megawatts of production. So, every configuration you can imagine and size you can imagine has really been developed in the geothermal sector. But heat, capability of fluid flow, and having a fluid to be able to circulate that high temperature are the necessary criteria to get the right geologic hotspot.
And then as a follow-up, are there dangers like increased earthquakes due to drilling for geothermal energy?
Yeah, it's a great question. In large part, the kind of largest source of earthquakes or induced seismicity from subsurface activity is what's come from the oil and gas industry as a byproduct of fracking, where they've pumped water into wastewater injection wells and pumped huge volumes of fluid into these wells that really alter the state of the subsurface in a way that changes stresses that can make things shift around. So I told y'all I went to school at the University of Tulsa while I was living there, even though there's never been any historic tectonic activity or seismic activity there. We started feeling earthquakes, up to a magnitude 5 earthquake that happened there just a few years ago. And they ended up zeroing in on this problem of wastewater injection wells, which is pumping a huge volume of fluid down an injection well just in one spot that really alters the state of the subsurface. And fortunately, geothermal doesn't do that. What we do is we use injection wells, but then we immediately produce that water back up to production wells. So we're not actually changing the volume of fluid that's in the subsurface. We're not really manipulating or adjusting the fluid levels or pressure there. It's just a closed loop system that continues circulating. So we don't have that same kind of alteration that has been a major problem for the oil and gas sector. I'd say even though it's a safer process, it's something that we pay a lot of attention to. And the United States has developed what's called the Induced Seismicity Mitigation Protocol that deals with this issue of potentially altering the subsurface in a way that could cause earthquake activity. And even though there's never been any instance of this happening in the United States for geothermal, it still is screened and applied for every geothermal project that's developed. So this is a protocol that's followed very closely, and I think it's important for maintaining the safety and why the U.S. has been so successful in developing this. And just one more point, I already complained about how there's kind of this fast-tracked and easy regulation for the oil and gas sector and not the geothermal sector. It's very well known that oil and gas activity causes a lot of earthquakes and has been well known for a decade. Yet there's no equivalent induced seismicity protocol for oil and gas. So there's nobody screening it. There's no federal regulations around it. It's just the geothermal sector that has never had an issue with that in the US that has to proactively apply that plan. So it's just yet another way where you get a regulatory environment that is a lot more favorable to fossil fuel development than it is to renewable energy development, which I think given where we are in 2021 and the urgency of climate change is just kind of wild to me. But hopefully that's something that can be addressed quickly.
Great. And Tyler asks, what does the financing landscape for geothermal look like? Is it mostly venture or more established project finance players getting involved?
Yeah, it depends on the phase of the project, right? So it's a great question because financing is really important. And I think one of the things that unlocked wind and solar is financing, you know, and I think a lot of times people focus way too much on just capital cost and not so much on what your cost of what the cost of financing is. So, you know, early days when solar was unproven, it was difficult to find financing, and so the rate of return that investors expected was super high. But as solar became a much more repeatable, built-out resource, you saw those costs come down tremendously. So now you could build a solar project, and investors might only expect a 5% return on it, which actually, when you think about what that means for the cost of the energy delivered, it's massive. It's a massive difference than if the investors were to expect a 15% return over a 25-year time frame. So one of the big stories of success of wind and solar is they were able to prove the kind of repeatability needed to lower the cost of financing. Geothermal has to win that battle. You know, we're still early in that phase. It's a small resource. It's proven to be unpredictable in the past. We have to show these methods like horizontal drilling that I was talking about, like the different methods of identifying resources, different ways of better utilizing low temperature resources are effective so that we can get that kind of lower cost of financing. Because the landscape right now, it really depends on what stage you are in development. You know, and our projects are risky enough in the early stages that investors expect a very high return before that first well is drilled. And even after that first well is drilled, they still expect a high return until there's more wells drilled. So really our capital stack, you know, you start with investors that have that kind of risk appetite, whether they're venture investors or private equity investors that can take that bet early on in the resource. Now, once you've drilled enough wells, you can usually go and get construction debt and safer forms of financing with a lower cost of financing to do things like build the power plant, you know, once you've confirmed that the resource is there. So at that stage of development, you know, we're going to the same folks that solar and wind are going to. We're going to the tax equity investors. We're going to construction debt lenders, big banks or infrastructure banks. And the financing landscape is a lot easier and looks a lot more like other infrastructure projects and other wind and solar projects. But for our industry right now, that early days are, it's still very, very challenging. Until we prove we can be repeatable, we're talking about venture and private equity financing to let us get these projects commissioned and drilled out to a point that we can tap into more infrastructure financing.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Tim. You have a lot of compliments here in our chat. People are saying it's very cool, and thanks for your passion for geothermal. Unfortunately, we're out of time for your talk, but I was wondering, could people reach out to you on LinkedIn if they had further questions? Because we actually had quite a number of questions for you.
Absolutely. LinkedIn. I'll be honest, I don't spend as much time on LinkedIn. I do tweet a lot. So if people are energy Twitter people, find me on Twitter. You'll probably have better luck there. But either way, try, and I appreciate the compliments. And my last parting thing I'll say, there's a reason why geothermal is sometimes left out of these policy things like the ITC and other things. And it's just, as a small resource, we just don't get talked about enough, you know? So I like giving events like this because I like exposing people to, and telling people about geothermal. So, you know, one of the things you can do to take action, just talk about geothermal, you know, make people know it's a policy priority, you know, let people know that 100% clean energy is a worthy goal and geothermal can play a role there. So if people are excited about geothermal, yeah, reach out to me on Twitter and just talk about geothermal more, and that'll help our industry a lot.
Okay, well, great. Thank you. And we'll see the rest of you at 5 for our final speaker.
Thank you.